Hi, it's Chris O'Leary here with Amy Vaz, who she's been following my podcast and has been following me on Twitter. My handle, Ivan Does Not. And she had some questions and which I thought were relevant to the kind of the general topic of abuse. So I asked her if she wanted to come on. She agreed. So we're here. So, the floor is yours. I'm interested in what you are interested in, what questions you have. So,
Okay, fantastic. Well, first of all, I just want to say that, Chris, you've really done a fantastic job with your podcast. And I think it's a really important story. And it's, happened on a very large scale in the United States, clergy sex abuse, and really around the world, not just in the US. And interestingly enough, I'll give you just a little brief background of how I uh, kind of came to this. I don't have any particular connection with the abuse aspect, but I was raised Catholic, very staunch, weekly mass, Catholic school, all the sacraments, the whole 9 yards. I got married in the church. And the first place where I lived with my husband was Boston. And it was in 2003 to 2004 when the story was unfolding there.
right.
And at the time, I just gave them the benefit of the doubt. I said, there's just no way it could be this bad. And I made excuses and I just really had blinders on, I think. But what really, really shook me was watching the movie Spotlight in 2016. And at that moment, for me, the blinders just came off. And I did a lot of research and a lot of reading, and I realized that not only what is it very accurately depicted, but I thought, if anything, it was putting it mildly.
Yeah.
Compared to what actually happened and how it happened. And again, didn't just happen in Boston. That was the story in Boston, but it happened from coast to coast in I would say every major metropolitan area and even a lot of remote areas. So I really sunk my teeth into it and started reading a lot. And interestingly enough, I had previously studied the Holocaust, and I actually think there are some parallels between those two atrocities.
Now,
In terms of the number of people who were involved and the number of entities that, enabled it and looked the other way. And I know in your story, you mentioned there was a nun and there was Father Dolan and at least two other people who knew about it and were in a position to do something about it. And they just really chose not to.
right. And I've used that analogy before of the Holocaust. And, I have a lot of Jewish friends, and I know it's not a direct comparison, but this is, I think I said, this isn't Jaws. We're not comparing scars. Bad is bad. And it was a terrible thing. And there are a couple problems. I think some people will say, well, but how many people really died as a result of the Catholic sex abuse crisis? Well, I can think of three guys just immediately leap to mind. And how many others died, I don't know. And I don't think anybody knows, and that's part of the problem. There's been no accounting for that. Plus all the lives affected by it. And then the other analogy to the point of Father Dolan, now Cardinal Dolan, is the denazification process. At least in the Holocaust, there was a denazification process at the end of things. There was an accountability. There's been no comparable denazification process when it comes to the Catholic sex abuse crisis. The guys who saw stuff and turned a blind eye to it in the 70s and the 80s, and then covered things up in 2002 are the ones who are running the church and are actually the candidates for Pope, which is just insane.
Right. And another thing, so again, just tell me again the years that your abuse happened. Was it in the late 70s, right?
Yeah, it was 77 to 81. Okay. So essentially the timeline is Dolan came to Immaculata in, like May, June 76. my abuser Valentine came to Immaculata in May, June 77. And then Valentine and Dolan overlapped for 2 years from, May 77 to May of 79. But then Valentine was there for an additional year or two at Immaculata till 81 or so. And then
Okay.
he rotated to actually to my current parish, which is just half mile that way. He was there for a year, and then he started kind of getting rotated on. So that's the time frame, is basically late 70s, the very earliest parts of the 1980s. Well,
Okay.
and I should mention that's important, because I've mentioned a document with respect to Father, now Cardinal Dolan. I've mentioned a document called the Matrix.
Mhm.
And if you look in the Matrix, is a legal document produced under court order by the Archdiocese of St. Louis pursuant to civil litigation. And the Matrix doesn't contain any complaints about Valentine prior to 1982, which I think is an effort by the Archdiocese of St. Louis to say, well, there was nothing for Dolan to see. Dolan's not dirty because nothing was happening.
Right, right. And surely, these kind of disclosures happened in every diocese, and I've heard and read that, of course, they're very incomplete. I mean, they're just cherry picking the information that they want to give, and there's usually a lot more to it than what they're disclosing.
No, yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the hard parts about being a survivor, and what survivors can tell you is the gaps.
Mm-hmm,
And that's a good point and a good question of, what's the big deal about these short disclosures, these incomplete disclosures? Is, as a result of abuse, I already have a problem with dissociation and feeling like I don't exist. And whenever I see a document produced that doesn't include my name, like the Matrix, that just triggers that whole feeling of not existing. And it's,
mm-hmm.
from a
Yes.
psychological standpoint, that's really difficult.
Absolutely. Okay, now the other thing I wanted to do is I wanted to talk a little more about Dolan, because I think people who are not Catholic might not understand just the level of, so he was a brand new priest. He
Right.
was ordained in 1976, so he was a brand new priest when you crossed paths with him. But now he is arguably, I would say, one of, if not the most powerful priest in the United States.
Right. Yeah, you've got Cardinal Sean, who has more access, Cardinal Sean O'Malley of Boston, who has more access to the Pope.
Mhm.
But Cardinal Sean is kind of a shy guy, whereas Dolan is more kind of out there. So I think you could still argue that Dolan is the face of the church. And one of the scary things for me is that Dolan really laid low for about 5 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
And now he seems to have found his mojo again, and he's out there. And that is really
Yes,
problematic to me.
absolutely. Absolutely. And he's hobnobbing with, high society, high New York society, and just really is just unquestioned.
Right. And that was really difficult for me to see the Met Gala stuff. And, he's with the Rockettes every year and being feted. And, one of the things they talk about is the Brett Kavanaugh Supreme Court hearings, how difficult that was for his, whatever her status was. I'm just going to call her a survivor.
Mhm,
Something happened there, it seems like.
mhm.
Uh, how difficult it must have been for her to, Christine Blasey Ford, how difficult it must have been for her to suddenly see him at the top of the world. Well, I can completely understand that, because that's what it was like for me. It was easier for me when Dolan was laying low, but now that he's been raising his head and raising his profile, talking to Christine Amanpour on CNN,
Mhm.
that's very difficult.
Yes, yes. So let's go through a little bit of the timeline. So from the time that your abuse happened to the time that you understood it. And let's talk about the concept of repressed memory, which I
Right.
think is what happened in your case, and how long it took you to realize what happened.
Right. Well, and so with respect to repressed memory, well, one reason I believe myself is because I don't have that much repressed memory. I did repress the worst stuff, but I remembered like 95% of it. And the difficult part is a lot of those are my most cherished memories. And I feel like a complete idiot for not understanding what that meant. But the fact is, I was a child. You know,
Mhm.
I was 10, maybe 9 when it started. Uh, I was just I was a smart but naive kid and didn't have much knowledge of the world and sex and all that kind of stuff. Uh, I don't think I had any concept of homosexuality. You know, it was a very common, faggot was a very common slur. I don't, people would call me oh query, oh fairy. I think when I started to act out as a result of stuff, but I don't think I knew what that meant. I just knew that it was bad. Uh, but then, so one of the reasons I believe myself is because there wasn't that much repressed memory. My therapist didn't do any prompting, and that's actually one of the reasons why it took so long for me to come forward. Is I would be in therapy, and my therapists weren't ethically allowed to ask me any questions, which goes to the point of why statutes of limitation are so problematic, because if survivors aren't allowed to get any prompting, I mean,
Mhm.
I just had no idea what to look for, and I didn't know what I was dealing with. And then this goes to the point of Cardinal Dolan, where he essentially sent me on a wild goose chase. Well, so let's go to timeline.
Yeah.
So the first, so I was having problems in the 90s. I first started having problems, I'd say, in the very early 90s. Well, so okay, so I was in went to college, San Antonio, Texas, Trinity University, 86 to 90. And was basically completely clean there, except for the last half semester of senior year where I was thinking about coming back to St. Louis. And I think that was causing some gender confusion stuff to come up. But so that's the second half of 90. I come back to St. Louis and then kind of immediately start having like sexual stuff plus depression, gender confusion stuff, because he treated, I had no conception of homosexuality, no, no conception of pedophilia. I just didn't understand why a man would treat a boy like this unless he thought he was a girl.
Mhm.
So, it was a very matter of fact connection for me.
Mhm.
Uh, so I can kind of trace the rebounding of that stuff. Uh, Went to grad school in St. Louis from 93, 94, had problems, some gender confusion stuff, a lot of depression. I kind of committed to St. Louis in, well, I guess it was the fall of 92 through the spring of 94 was when I was at WashU in St. Louis for grad school MBA. Had problems with depression, got married during that time, no idea what it was, learned about cognitive behavioral therapy, which was good. But then just kind of went on with my life dealing with something that I thought was seasonal affective disorder. I didn't know what the name was. Uh, Lived in Arizona for a year, 96, 97, felt a lot better, didn't know why, just knew that a lot of the stuff went away, except I did have gender confusion stuff and other stuff when the thought of coming back to St. Louis for, I guess it would be Easter of 97. The thought of that prompted a lot of stuff and stirred a lot of stuff up and caused problems for me. But again, I had no idea what it was. I just knew that there was something problematic about coming back to St. Louis. But we ended up moving back to St. Louis in July of 97, uh, committed to St. Louis, to raising our family in St. Louis by their grandparents, which was a decision that made sense. It was really, it was problematic. It made sense from a family standpoint, but it was very problematic. But I didn't know why. Had a major problem essentially with reenactments in August of 97, essentially I committed to coming back to St. Louis, and just the mere act of committing to St. Louis caused all this gender stuff to come up. But again, I didn't know what it was. So I just kind of lived my life until so January 2002, the original Spotlight articles ran. I don't think I really found out about them until early March 2002, when the New York Times ran a piece that was basically my personal Spotlight article, Name My Abuser. And I was just, it was very confusing, because he was my favorite priest and one of my favorite people in the world. And I didn't have any clear memories. And like I said, a lot of the memories I did have were my most cherished memories. He was the person who made me feel special and singled out, and the whole thing. So I went to the Archdiocese of St. Louis, and that's when by then Bishop Dolan called me back. Hey, Chris, Tim Dolan, Bishop Dolan, how you been? Been a long time. So we talked. I told him 4 memories: face-to-face confession, the Risk and Pizza Party in the Rectory. And it's weird, I'm sitting here trying to think about it, and it's my mind is like trying to blank out, which is what it does. But I'll get through it. I have to like clear my mind and go through this whole kind of Zen exercise to remember what I told him.
Well, you don't have to go. You
Yeah,
don't. If you don't
I'm
want
just
to, you
going
don't
to do
have
it.
to go
I'll
through.
just
But
say,
just you had the
yeah.
conversation with Dolan.
Right. So I talked to Dolan. I did tell him the only memory I told him was coming back from a mud cave trip, which was the only negative memory I had. We're just kind of out of the blue, and I was riding shotgun in the station wagon, and I woke up from a nap and looked over at Valentine, and he just looked like Satan to me, and I didn't understand what that meant. It was powerful enough that I remembered it, but I had no idea what it meant. But so then Dolan immediately, without any investigation, tells me, I've known Leroy Valentine forever. We were at the seminary together. We lived and worked together at Immaculata. I know he didn't do any of the things that he's accused of. I know he could never do anything to hurt a child. And that was enough for me. And that was a definitive hard no. Dolan did refer me to a woman that he sold as an independent psychologist, but I think she was actually the assistance coordinator for the Archdiocese of St. Louis, a woman who I think was Nancy Brown. She again told me the same thing, that I was just misinterpreting stuff. And it's funny, I was reading an article yesterday, you may have seen the tweet, where most of this stuff is what men do to women, unfortunately. But there was a quote in there where it was the word misinterpreting was used. So that's like a trigger word for me, a key word for me.
Yes, I think Cuomo has used that.
Okay, it wouldn't. Yeah, he seems pretty. Yeah, the presence of that word is pretty definitive. But so early March 2002, I get a hard no from Dolan. The psychologist tells me I'm just misinterpreting things, and I just go on with my life thinking I'd been given a clean bill of health. And then February 2003, my older son makes his first confession. I have what I guess was a panic attack. 2 years later, my older daughter makes her first confession. I have a panic attack. I'm like, what the hell is going on? So I ended up contacting David Clossie of Snap in late summer, early fall of 2005. Basically reached out to him wanting to talk, but he replied to me, but I never replied back to him. I don't know exactly why, but I think it was just unthinkable for me. I think that's the reason I didn't reply to his reply to me, was that, there's just no way. It's not possible. There's no point in even considering it. But what I did do at the same time was I contacted the writers of the New York Times article, Jody Wilgerin and Lori Goodstein. And Wilgerin told me, I asked her, do you believe this stuff? And she's like, well, we wouldn't have run the article if we didn't believe it. So I didn't know what to make of that. But, and it's hard for me to say exactly how that made me feel. Confusion was probably the biggest thing. And the Dolan denial was definitely weighing on me. This is a man I trusted implicitly, a kind man I knew from serving. I'd served for him. He was a very nice man to serve for. If you screwed up, he wouldn't hiss at you. He would just, he was a very good guy, was how I thought of him. And he gave me a hard no. So, and plus he was a big deal, because by that June, he'd been named Archbishop of Milwaukee. And there were rumors that he was on to bigger things, maybe the biggest thing, that he could be the first American Pope. So when the first American Pope tells you nothing happened, you believe him, or a candidate for the first American Pope tells you nothing happened, you believed him.
So for how many years after that conversation did you continue to struggle with this and grapple with this?
Basically 10 years.
Okay.
It was Dolan sent me on a 10-year wild goose chase.
Okay.
So I had a nervous breakdown in basically June of 2007. And it's really crazy because, so the worst stuff, as near as I can tell, the worst stuff happened the week before the 4th of July when my parents were out of town. That's how Valentine would get at me. To the question of where were your parents? Well, my parents were in West Virginia at the Greenbrier, and I was at home with the babysitter. So it's no surprise that I have a nervous breakdown again right before the 4th of July, 2007, and really start struggling, trying to do like entrepreneurship stuff, but I had a hard time concentrating, and what I would call productivity problems. Divorced in 2009. And that's when I started seeing a therapist, and I basically spent a year working with that therapist, talking about family stuff and trying to get understand what had happened to me in terms of the family. And then by 2010, we were talking about my productivity problems. But I was, and during that time from 2002 to 2010, I was just grasping at straws in terms of, I was obviously dealing with something. I don't think I realized I was having a nervous breakdown until 2010 or something, but I was looking at adult ADHD. I was looking at different autism spectrum stuff, Asperger's syndrome, that kind of stuff. Just like I said, I was on a wild goose chase because Dolan had ruled out the Valentine sex abuse stuff. So I was just trying to explore every possible alternate explanation. It wasn't until the fall of 2010 that I started talking about Valentine. And I know that date because that's part of what created the statute of limitations problem for me in terms of the lawsuit, where I started, I had run out of things to talk about. So in 2010, I started bringing up Valentine, and I'm like, do you think this Valentine stuff that I talked about with Dolan in 2002, do you think that could mean anything? And my psychologist, who wasn't trauma trained, basically for a year said no. But by May 2011, I was thinking, and I think he was thinking, that maybe there was something there, but there was nothing. I was still dealing with repressed memory. I hadn't recovered any memories or anything. I hadn't understood my memories, but I went back to the Archdiocese of St. Louis and basically told them in May 2011 the same stuff I told Dolan in March 2002, with one additional memory, which was wrestling. So I told them kind of the 4 memories: face-to-face confession, the risk and pizza party, special training, and then the mud cave trip. And I added wrestling, which I think happened at the same time as the risk and pizza party. And essentially the wrestling thing is how Valentine got it, guys, where he would teach us how to wrestle, and what he would do is he would grope us down
And
there.
I've heard that in other stories.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty common MO. And essentially, so you've mentioned this, we should probably talk about this more, but talking about the grooming thing.
Yes.
Well, before grooming, there's a process that I call testing,
Mm.
where essentially what he would do is he would wrestle with you, and then he would grab you down there and see if you reacted. And I
Okay.
know one guy who got touched, and he almost threw him across the room, and that was a no.
Wow.
So he failed the test. But there are
Wow.
other guys who, I didn't react. I didn't react on the outside. I reacted on the inside. I just kind of froze. Essentially, is what happened. Is I froze. Uh,
And
I
that's a normal reaction
right,
for a
right,
child.
right.
So it
It was like
happened
an electric.
gradually,
What?
very gradually.
Yeah. Right.
Mm-hmm. And also just, I want to reiterate that the way that we're programmed as Catholics, not to even question a priest.
Right. I
And
mean,
that plays a big part of this as well.
it's Father Valentine. Come on.
Mm-hmm.
In persona Christi. This is the nearest incarnation to Jesus Christ on earth. So obviously, this isn't a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why a lot of it didn't register with me, because it was Father Valentine. Come on, it's impossible. But
Right.
so I go to the review team in May 2011. I tell them the 4 memories plus the wrestling, and there were problems with that meeting. There were 2 lawyers there when there weren't supposed to be any lawyers there. And they pretty much immediately gave me a diagnosis, which is, this is all your dad's fault.
Oh.
Deacon Phil Hengen gave me a book to read called Man Enough, which is for guys it's a book for guys who have problems with their dads, abusive dads, that kind of stuff. But it's not, I had some issues with my dad, but it wasn't any, there was no sexual stuff with my dad. Why am I having all this sexual stuff? And I was having sexual obsessions, and a lot of my productivity problems were due to compulsive sexual activity, which, to my point about the Portland, Oregon stuff, essentially, so what happened to me in 97 in Portland, Oregon in August, or in August 97, was compulsive reenactments of what was happening to me, triggered by my coming back to St. Louis and settling down in St. Louis, where I was trying to reenact what happened to me. I was trying to reenact my rape as a child and setting things up. And that's all, that's all I'm going to say about that. But it was a compulsive reenactment of what had happened to me. But so that's May of 2011. The review team takes 2 months to get back to me. And they essentially say, well, Father Valentine said nothing happened. So I'm like, well, what do you expect him to say? But they thought that, they acted like that meant something. But I kept trying to push them to help me and to do something, and they wouldn't do anything. But so I stayed in therapy, and I actually picked up a second. Well, so by early 2011, I was starting to recover stuff. I was starting to recover the 5% of stuff that I hadn't remembered. And there's one memory I always had of running from, bailing out of the rectory. And I had no idea what that meant. I've talked about that memory on the podcast. And essentially, I come to realize that, I end up under a tree and my ass feels like it's on fire. And, that obviously means something. And so by 2011, I was starting to realize what that meant. But then, from 2011, 2012, 2013, I'm trying to get the Archdiocese of St. Louis to help me. And all they're doing is just giving me the runaround. In May of 2013, they end up removing my abuser, Father Leroy Valentine, from, well, they permanently removed him. They didn't defrock him or, remove him from the priesthood, but essentially they changed his status such that he would no longer have a posting at a school, which was good. But the problem is they never contacted me to warn me about that or help me.
So he was an active priest for 3 decades after your abuse.
It's a little questionable about exactly what happened. So and this is another part of the thing with Dolan. So I talked to Dolan in early March 2002. He gives me a hard no. It's impossible. Nothing happened.
Mhm.
At the same time, another guy comes forward in early March 2002. I have a document that proves that. Uh, and then at the end of March 2002, a third guy comes forward at least. And that forces Dolan to, I think, ask my abuser, Father Leroy Valentine, to resign. So Valentine resigns, and the Archdiocese of St. Louis essentially cut him loose, which is really problematic. I know that's the gut impulse for Catholics is you don't want any more money to go to these guys, but it's really irresponsible to just cut these guys loose because you've got known abusers. But so he lived for some number of years in a private residence. I've heard it was his mom's house. But so you've got a multi-accused child sex abuser living in a private residence, unsecured, unsupervised for some number of years in the early 2000s, early to mid 2000s, first under now Cardinal Justin Francis Regali, then under now Cardinal Raymond Leo Burke. And this is one of the reasons I think why my story is so threatening is my story actually involves and implicates 3 and really 4 cardinals of the Catholic Church, Dolan, Burke, Regali, and O'Malley.
Mm.
But so then at some point, the Archdiocese of St. Louis, I think, pulled Valentine back in and had him live at Regina Cleary, which is the retirement home. Although I'm not, which theoretically is more secure, but I'm not sure how much more secure or supervised he was at that point. But, just in terms of figuring stuff out, it wasn't until, I didn't really start figuring stuff out until 2011 or so. So that's what I mean. That's kind of the wild goose chase is from
Mhm.
2002 to 2011 is the extent of the wild goose chase that, then first Father, then Bishop, now Cardinal Timothy Dolan sent me on. So that's kind of, I filed a lawsuit in 2015, settled it in 2017 because the statute of limitations problems, ended up with $9,000, which is barely enough to cover the cost of my cancer surgery. And I've just taken that money and have put it into a social media campaign trying to make people aware of the reality of things, what Spotlight did and did not change, what Vos Estis did or did not change. So that's kind of that's the gist of it. There was a lot of repressed memory, not as much as you see in the movies, but it's, so kind of the bottom line on the repressed memory stuff is I remember the vast majority of it, 95%. I just didn't understand what it meant.
Okay.
And Dolan didn't do anything to help me understand what it meant or what it might have meant.
Okay. So it sounds like there was just a tremendous amount of damage done during that time, that decade after that conversation with him. And that if he had just come clean and said, yes, I believe this did happen and it is substantiated by others, your life could have taken a whole different turn. It
Right.
sounds
And there were multiple opportunities for them to intervene, and 2013 was really one of the most difficult times for me. And it triggers that sense of I don't exist. When they remove Valentine and essentially admit this is a really bad guy, but they didn't warn me. They didn't do anything to help me. That's what triggers this whole feeling of I don't exist. And that's what contributes to the nervous breakdowns and stuff I'm still trying to dig my way out of. And then, that was further worsened by The Matrix, which was released in January 2014, which is the legal document. And, my allegation doesn't appear in The Matrix under accused individual number 107, which is Valentine. But all that stuff, all that denial of my claims again and again and again, that just grinds on you and pounds on you and leads you to believe that you don't exist. And I'm still dealing with that stuff, in 2018, April, basically in 4 days will be the 3-year anniversary. I went public in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch article. And in that article, the Archdiocese said, O'Leary came to us and his story changed multiple times, which is a complete lie.
And that's a very common line used by abusers and their enablers also. Um, yes.
And that was very difficult, and that's very hard to process. And that's one of the reasons why I'm being shunned by the people of St. Louis, is because, hey, the archdiocese told everybody I'm just lying. Even though they've admitted all this stuff and they removed him, they forced him to resign in 2002 and they permanently removed him in 2013, I'm lying. Well, I suspect that the reason why they're maintaining that line is because of the threat I posed to Dolan, Regali, Burke, and O'Malley.
Right. Do you still attend church today?
Well, so I'm still a Christian. In a lot of ways, I'm still a Catholic in my head, because I really understand and get the Mary stuff and the saint stuff in particular. A lot of what I'm doing is courage stuff, and you have to have courage. So I really appreciate the saints. One of my mantras is, if Jesus Christ can do what he did, entering Jerusalem on Palm Sunday to a certain and known fate, then I can do this. So that makes me a Christian. And, and a lot of the saints are about the same kind of thing, models of courage. The problem is that I haven't attended mass since Easter 2014, when I had a flashback. I hadn't seen an old style black cassock with the white surplice kind of sheer curtain kind of stuff on top of it since I'd left Immaculata, because at Mary Queen of Peace, they used the white robe alb stuff. So I hadn't seen an Immaculata style server getup since I was a child. And then I was at mass in Easter 2014. And then suddenly the seminarians there in the old style getup, like we used to wear when we were kids. And that just triggered like a major flashback in episode for me. So I haven't been able to set foot in mass since Easter 2014. Really doing the podcast. I record the podcast on Sunday, and that's my way of basically going to church. I still consider myself a Christian, and I think I'm probably a stronger Christian than I was in the past, but the whole Catholic thing is difficult for me. But I'm not asking people to leave. That's not the goal. But I understand if they would, especially if they've got young kids, because I don't believe that kids are safe in the church. That's the biggest problem is, as I said earlier, there's been no denazification process.
Right. And I just want to mention, so I think we all know the playbook that, they would move priests around, like first within a diocese, and then if it got to be really bad, they would send them farther away. And in kind of doing my research on this, I read about some situations where in the most egregious cases, some priests were actually sent to South America.
Right.
And we don't even know, I mean, we have no way of tracking that, but they were intentionally sent to places where remote locations where, they would definitely find a whole new crop of victims, and the victims would have no recourse. I mean, they were intentionally places like that. So just again, I want to reiterate the level of damage done with this is just, it's hard to even wrap your mind around it. It's really on a very large scale. And conservatively, it's 6% of priests. That's the number from Richard Sipe, and I think there are places where the percentage is much higher. But if you just do the math on that, and if you figure that each priest could have 100 sometimes victims, or sometimes
and 100
more.
100 is the number I've used for my abuser.
Oh,
and that
wow.
could just be at Immaculata.
Right.
He went after everybody. He tested nearly everybody, near as I can tell.
Wow. So then each person, if you figure not only the damage done to each person, but damage done to families,
right.
That's also should be part of how we look at this. And it's just, impossible to put a number on it, but I think the numbers would be staggering.
Right. And I have, I went through a divorce and I have difficulties with my ex-wife and my kids, but on my best days, I regard them as survivors. They're survivors as much as I am. And just to your point about the scale of this, that level of depravity is the really scary part. And it's so obviously of Satan. And the fact that it's still happening is the really scary part, because the core ideas that made this happen, I don't know. And that's one of the things I'm trying to figure out is, how do you get to this point where that's a viable option? And it could be, there were incentives to create priests and all that mattered were the numbers. And maybe that was because somebody believes that as long, the more priests we have saying mass, the more grace there is in the world. That's something that Cardinal Sarah said actually a couple of weeks ago. So more priests mean more grace, and if some kids have to get raped along the way, then
it's like
seems
collateral
like a hard
damage.
Yeah, that seems like a place to stop, but for whatever reason it seems like that idea is still operating within the Catholic Church, and that's one of the reasons that's one of the things I'm trying to get at, and one of the reasons I'm still going with this.
Right. And I've wondered that too. I mean, the question of, it's like a chicken and egg question, like does the church attract some of these people for certain reasons, or is it something that happens to people after they've entered the priesthood, and maybe some combination thereof?
Yeah, I think it's a combination. I think there's a lot of attracting going on, but there's some combination. There are problems within the seminaries. There's abuse going on within the seminaries, and I think abuse can lead to kind of stuff falling down the hill. And
Yes.
if you're not necessarily creating abusers, you're unleashing or enabling abusive tendencies. But that's
Right.
that's one of the reasons I'm doing this, and that's one of the questions I'm still trying to get at is, why is this stuff still happening? What are the empowering ideas that created this in the first place and that are still creating the problems? That's one of the reasons I'm doing this, and that's one of the problems I'm trying to solve.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I'm just looking at, I had a list of things to cover. I think we've covered quite a bit of it. I did want to just bring up in the case of the clergy abuse, how some of the other entities and individuals who have been involved in enabling it. So it runs the gamut from local police, prosecutors, local press who just didn't cover it over the years. And then you mentioned in your case the state attorney general of Missouri, who basically did a sham investigation. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. So that specifically implicates the current junior senator from the state of Missouri, Josh Hawley. And I tend to be a Republican, but I mean, what are you guys doing, turning a blind eye to abuse? That doesn't seem to be a very strong brand statement.
Well, it's bipartisan because Kamala Harris did it in California too.
Yeah, no, and that's why I didn't vote for President Biden. I just kind of sat on my hands for this election, was because of Harris. But so essentially, the Pennsylvania grand jury report comes out in August 2018. Then Missouri Attorney General Josh Hawley says he's going to open this investigation of the Archdiocese of St. Louis. That turned out to be a sham. I tried to speak with them multiple times, spoke to the lead investigator, Christine. They just kind of put me off. And then Hawley ended up winning the election, went on to Washington as the senator for the state of Missouri, replaced by Eric Schmidt. 2 days before Schmidt takes office on January 1st, 2019, I start getting harassed by a family member of his first assistant of his first assistant attorney general, a guy named Tom Albus, who I know from the Mary Queen of Peace baseball committee. This family member starts attacking me, calling me a liar. So I immediately know that I'm not going to get a fair shake from the attorney general's office. I have to force Missouri Attorney General Eric Schmidt's team to talk to me first in February, using the press as a hammer. I ended up talking to Schmidt again in July 2019. And essentially in that one, I told them where the bodies were buried. I told them what documents to look for and in what folders. And if this document isn't in this folder, then you know they're screwing with you. To my knowledge, they didn't act on any of that information. Instead, Schmidt killed the investigation, wrapped everything up within a couple of weeks. I think because his investigators were starting to believe me, because I was giving them, I was giving them documents and saying, look for this document. This document should be in this folder. If it's not, then you know that they're not being straight with you. I think Schmidt, who's a faithful Catholic, didn't want to know that. And the involvement of law enforcement goes all the way back. I think that there was a program in place within St. Louis where they would put abusers at certain parishes in certain municipalities. St. Louis is like 100 small, tiny little municipalities. And I think what happened is they chose municipalities with favorable mayors and chiefs of police, and they would only station abusers in certain municipalities. And that's one of the things I'm going to talk about in the next episode of the podcast, is that program. And I think that the existence of that program is one of the things that the Archdiocese of St. Louis is trying to protect. But I've got, in the March 2002 New York Times piece, a criminal act, a violation of the Mann Act, is disclosed, which essentially prohibits transporting minors across state lines for criminal purposes. So the Mud Cave trip, as far as I know, Valentine took me down Highway 44 within the state of Missouri to that Mud Cave trip. But when Valentine was posted in the northern part of St. Louis County, he took people to Pere Marquette Park, which is in the state of Illinois. Therefore, he had to cross a state line, which makes that act a federal crime. And that was actually laid out in that New York Times article, including with the name of someone that they could talk to. And that, to my knowledge, the FBI never investigated that at the time in 2002. And I've since gone back to the FBI in St. Louis twice, pointing out, here is a criminal act for which there should be no statute of limitations. To my knowledge, they've never investigated that. So you've got the FBI, you've got federal law enforcement involved in this, state law enforcement, municipal law enforcement. And then as you said, you've also got the press involved. The Schmidt thing. I went to the press conference in September 2019, where Schmidt announced the results of his findings, just literally to be there in the room, and was thrown. They sent 10 people after me to throw me out of the room.
Wow.
And local station KMOV got the whole thing on tape. Essentially, I walked into the room with a KMOV photographer, and going into the room, someone from the Attorney General's office, he asked us who we were. The KMOV guy identified myself as a survivor. And the Attorney General's office guy was like, well, you can't be here. And I'm like, it's okay. It's no big deal. And the KMOV guy threw me a look. So then when the Attorney General's guy left, I assumed to notify people that there was a survivor in the room. The KMOV guy was like, if they try to throw you out of the room, I'm going to roll on you. I'm going to film the whole thing. So the KMOV guy actually filmed the whole thing, the whole 10-minute process that they're harassing me and throwing me out of the room, including calling the police. KMOV has never aired that footage to my knowledge.
Oh.
And the guy who filmed it thought it was a big enough deal that it was not just a local news item, but also maybe potentially a national news item. But KMOV, to my knowledge, is sitting on that footage. KSDK, the NBC affiliate, did a stand-up interview with me. The KMOV guy also did a stand-up interview with me afterwards. But so you've got KMOV, KSDK, KMOX, all have interviewed me and are aware of this stuff, and they're all sitting on the story. Yes, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch did interview me and run a piece in April 2018 and ran another piece in September 2018. But from that point on, they've shut down, I assume under pressure or merely for the fact that they don't want to tell the people of St. Louis stuff that they don't want to know. But so you've got all this enably kind of stuff going on where people are trying to protect the Archdiocese of St. Louis. And this includes the Catholic press with the Pope and Vos Estis Lux Mundi, his supposed survivor's Bill of Rights, where the lay Catholic press won't cover the fact that the Pope refuses to enforce Vos Estis. And I think what's happening is people are trying to protect the Catholic Church for whatever reason. And instead, what they're doing is they're enabling abuse. And that is putting children at risk and is keeping survivors from getting the help that we need. And that's a huge problem. And I think it's great that people like you are out there saying, this is unacceptable.
Yes. Well, I just think it's super interesting. How do you cross paths with all these people, with Dolan, with Holly? That's really something.
I was just a kid and that was the parish, but it's yeah, I'm a magnet for this kind of stuff. Well, and some of it is that, again, my mantra, if Jesus Christ can do what he did, then I can do this. So I have no fear in terms of telling Holly, demanding that he do what he said he's going to do. Same thing for the Attorney General.
That's good.
I'm actually contemplating a wildcat run for this Senate seat for the state of Missouri. Because you've got Eric Greitens, who is a philandering abuser of women who apparently tied up and blackmailed a woman. He's the leading candidate from the state of Missouri, which is absurd. And then you've also got Missouri Attorney General Eric Schmidt, the guy who completely enabled the Archdiocese of St. Louis. And they're trying to put themselves as, strong candidates and strong conservatives. And to me, if conservatism means enabling child sexual abuse and personally abusing women, I don't think that's a brand statement the Republican Party should be making. And I'm considering throwing my hat in the ring just to put myself up as an alternative. It probably won't go anywhere, but I think it's absurd what the Republican Party is doing right now and what they think in terms of branding. Although that's, Donald Trump was a serial abuser of women. So, but I think the soul of the Republican Party is at risk, and I'm considering making a bid to try to save it. We'll see what happens with that.
Wow. Well, at the very least, just to get the truth out about these people.
Right.
But I'm interested to just explore this just a little bit further. So Eric Schmidt, you said, is a devout Catholic, so that kind of makes sense how he would react. But
trying to protect his church, right?
But Kamala Harris, I mean, she has no connection to the Catholic Church. So how do you explain that? Do you think that it's just an unwillingness to go up against a powerful entity like the church, and also just an unwillingness to spend political capital that way?
I mean, that's the only thing I could think that makes sense. And some of it is not telling people what they don't want to hear. I don't know much about San Francisco and San Francisco politics and how many Catholics there are there. Maybe they're powerful and maybe they're rich and influential. And I think she made a political decision that it made more sense to not alienate even just one influential Catholic within San Francisco versus defending the rights of survivors. Politicians are politicians. And that would be one of my appeals is I'm not a politician, and I'm only concerned about doing the right thing. I don't care what anybody thinks. I only care what God thinks and what Jesus Christ thinks. I just want to do the right thing. I'm not impressed with Kamala Harris because it seems like, maybe she's just siding. Maybe it's just the fact that she's siding with the big guy She always gives faith in the big guy, regardless of what the explanation is. I don't think it's a good explanation for her behavior, and I think it's problematic. And it's why I couldn't vote for President Biden. Obviously, I couldn't vote for President Trump, but
Yeah.
it caused problems with Biden as well.
Yes. I mean, I think that was one of the story. I think there was maybe an Intercept story on it, but it didn't really get a lot of oxygen.
Yeah,
And I
never
thought that
saw.
was important.
Yeah, I never saw any coverage of it with respect to the election. So, which surprised me a little bit,
Yeah,
especially
I
given
think there were some things that I saw maybe that came out before she was chosen as VP though. But then after that, I never saw much after that.
Yeah, and it's a sadly increasingly common case of the press doing the work of
The powerful institutions, right?
right. Now, I had someone advance a kind of a twisted theory, which is, like the New York Times has had my story since 2005, and I went back to them in 2013. I have Dolan, who's in their backyard, that the New York Times knows about him. I had someone advance kind of a twisted story, which is the reason they're sitting on that is so that there can be another 2002 that hopefully, quote unquote, hopefully will crush the Catholic Church and kind of end it once and for all, rather than kind of doing this trickle drip 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 of stuff. You have another 2002 that happens, at some point, and they're kind of sitting on those stories and building up those stories to destroy the church, which is kind of an interesting story. And I would argue one of the reasons why Catholics should be pressing to get this stuff out, so that you're not accumulating this gigantic mass of an asteroid that can come in and destroy the entirety of the Catholic Church. It's really, if you seriously care about the Catholic Church, you should be fighting to get these stories out rather than letting them accumulate such that there's another 2002 and another spotlight.
Right. And first and foremost, I mean, if we care about children who are in danger, that's first and foremost.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that goes without saying, although this is the Catholic Church. So, God only.
Yeah. Well, I think they've probably taken a pretty big hit because of COVID.
Right.
But it is interesting how when the Spotlight story broke, and that was just obviously so much had been kind of pent up, and the lid was kept on the boiling pot for so many years, and then it all just came out. And then I think it kind of died down a little bit again. And for me, I mean, when the movie came out, that was just so formative and just such a extremely just pivotal time that, at that point, you can no longer give them the benefit of the doubt. That so much time has passed, and they're continuing to try to minimize and deny and deflect. And then another strategy of theirs, which it sounds like it happened to you, is they will just go on the attack against survivors.
Right. No, that's absolutely what they've done. Well, and they're even subtle narratives. Like, one of the narratives that's being pushed is that this is old news. That this was covered in 2002, and then this was covered again in 2018. And I've had a KMOX reporter ask me what's new, as if there's nothing new to this story, and the new aspects of the story. It starts with Dolan, and the involvement of Dolan, the involvement of multiple cardinals, the lack of accountability. I've deliberately tried to bounce my story off of Spotlight, not just because it's true, but also because I think a lot of people have seen Spotlight and think that Spotlight kind of marked the end of the story, but the reality is that Spotlight just marked the resumption of my story. In a lot of ways, my story is Spotlight 2.0. And that's how I'm trying to pitch it. I'm kind of curious if that Spotlight 2.0 resonates with you, if that makes sense to you, if you think that's a good way to kind of position the story.
Yes. I mean, I think it's continually relevant. I mean, I can't imagine saying that it's not. But I've heard the same thing that the news media essentially did the same thing with the story of Flint, Michigan,
Right.
with the water, that it's just not covered anymore, but except by Jordan Sheridan at Status Quo, and he's tried bringing it to some bigger outlets, and the response that he gets is that this is old news and people are not interested anymore. So it's very parallel
black
to what you're
news.
saying, but
Right.
their water is still really messed up. It did not get fixed. So it's very parallel, I think, to this.
Well, I think some of that has to do with the news, the nature of the news media and the news business, where
They're just looking for small sound bites and
right.
Mhm.
Right. And it's, so I guess all I can do is try to chop my story up into small pieces and make it palatable. But it's definitely, it's literally something that keeps me up at night. So that's one of the reasons why I'm still doing it and doing what I'm doing. The depravity that we've discussed and that you've pointed out, I don't understand how people can not have a problem with that level of depravity, especially in terms of shifting these guys not just within the United States but also to other countries.
Right.
I mean, how do you justify that?
Right.
That's so obviously of Satan. And the fact that people won't talk about Satan again makes me think that that is Satan, because who wouldn't want you to talk about Satan besides Satan?
Well, it's a culture of secrecy that remains, and
Right.
that's, they're protecting their power and their money and their interests, and that seems to come above all else. Do you want to talk about the sham that is the victim assistance coordinators?
Yeah, this has been a difficult week for me, because you've got the Catholic Project, which is run out of the Archdiocese of DC. They had an event yesterday where they had 3 victim assistance coordinators from Chicago, LA, and DC talking about how helpful they are. Well, and one of the things that people need to understand is that there's something like 175 bishops and archbishops and dioceses and archdioceses within the United States. Just because 3 of them are good doesn't mean that there aren't problems in the other 170. And I've actually talked to the assistance coordinators for LA and Chicago, possibly the exact people who were interviewed yesterday by the Catholic Project. And well, for one thing, and some of it's not their fault, but so each diocese, archdiocese is its own entity run by its own bishop or archbishop who is accountable only to the Pope. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops has no power. And they don't seem to use their soft power. You would think that 174 bishops ganging up on one could have some influence, but that's not what they do. So I went to the assistance coordinator for LA. They said, I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can do. I went to, the reason I talked to the Chicago assistance coordinator is that before the February 2019 sex abuse summit in the Vatican, the Pope told the cardinals, the attendees of that conference, that they should meet with survivors. So I talked to the Archdiocese of St. Louis and said, hey, I'm in St. Louis. I'd love to drive up and talk to Cardinal, is it Supich in Chicago? They engaged with me and talked to me, but I never got through to Supich. And again, the idea was, sorry, but we can't do anything about that. It's not, you're in a different diocese. We can only help people in Chicago, which is a problem that I call not my problem, or NIMPs. There are too many NIMPs in the Catholic Church, people who believe that they're not going to do anything if it's not their problem. And the reality for survivors in St. Louis, at least, and I have to wonder and worry about the other people in the other 172 dioceses and archdioceses, is that it's the stated policy of the Archdiocese of St. Louis, and I have this on tape and I will put it in my podcast in a later episode. The only thing they will do is, if you don't already have a counselor, the Archdiocese of St. Louis will give you the name of a counselor. And that's it. That's the only thing they will do. They won't pay for anything. They won't even pay for therapy or counseling, much less life and medication and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very difficult. It's very triggering for me to hear people talk about and people to extol the assistance coordinator program when I spent years and years and years, from May 2011 through the end of 2013 at least, and was never contacted by, introduced to, told to contact an assistance coordinator. And I've since come to learn that that's because the reason they didn't contact me, the assistance coordinator never contacted me, was because I already had a therapist, and they don't do or pay for anything. But
Right.
that's what people need to understand, is that it's, to your point, it's a sham. Are Catholics okay with the fact that the only thing the Archdiocese of St. Louis will do is give you the name of a therapist if you don't have one? And to the point about Vos Estis was supposed to change that. Vos Estis Lux Mundi is Pope Francis's Bill of Rights for survivors. It was supposed to mandate the treatment of survivors. Well, I've made multiple complaints to Rome, including via Cardinal Sean O'Malley, the Archbishop of Boston, one of the Pope's closest advisors, letting Cardinal Sean know, and I have a letter from Cardinal Sean letting the Pope know, hey, you make all these promises to survivors in Vos Estis. The Archdiocese of St. Louis isn't following up on those. I've made 10 appeals to the Pope through the papal nuncio in Washington, D.C. I've never heard anything. So not only is the assistance coordinator program a sham, but Vos Estis Lux Mundi, which is the canon law that was supposed to ensure that the assistance coordinator program is not a sham, it itself is a sham.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes.
that's all incredibly difficult, where I'm just trying to get help for myself and my family and my ex-wife, and they don't and won't do anything. And not only will they not do anything, but they'll lie about it in terms of Vos Estis. And what's worse is the Catholic press and lay Catholic supporters won't talk about the failure that is Vos Estis.
Right. Right. And I also have heard this. This is not the first time I've heard this exact story where you had sent a letter and you're sure that it was put in the hands of the Pope.
Right.
I've heard this in other stories as well, where other people have done this too, other survivors. And
no, I didn't know that, but it doesn't surprise me.
right. And the response is always nothing. It's always that they just never get any acknowledgement or response. And it's not like something that could have gotten lost in the shuffle, because they confirmed, put it in the hands of someone who said they put it in his hands. So I've definitely come across the same thing with others.
Yeah, I've got the letter from Cardinal Sean, and that was one of the most
Mhm.
difficult things, is that gave me hope. And so much of this is the
Yes.
problem
And
of a false
he
hope.
was supposed to be the guy who was going to really fix all of this. And
No, absolutely. And that's, if people want to leave, that's one of the reasons why I don't have a problem with their leaving, because Cardinal Sean, who is supposed to be the great white hope, is the only thing I can think is that he's been ordered by the Pope to stop doing this stuff.
yes.
And maybe he's pushing back on it and fighting it, but I mean, how do you value a church and a man and an oath to a man over Christ and children? That's something I can't understand. I could never do that,
Yes.
and I'm not doing it. I refuse to do it. I refuse to place a man before Christ.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Hold on just one second. Sorry.
Yeah.
But yes, and I think you mentioned that you were put in touch with a psychologist who was either working for the church or
Yeah, that's
paid
the
by the church.
person. That's the person that Dolan referred me to. He sold her as an independent psychologist, but she turned out to be the assistance coordinator for the Archdiocese of St. Louis.
Okay. Okay. So there's nothing independent about that.
No, and
Uh,
that's actually one of the problems. People. I came across this yesterday. So for a year ago, for a year or so, I was working with a very nice woman who's a Catholic who still goes to mass and that kind of stuff, who was offering me help. But the problem was is that turned into gaslighting because she had a really hard time believing what I was saying about Cardinal
mm,
Dolan and Archbishop Carlson. And even I would show her a transcript of what Carlson had told me, and she had a hard time believing that. And
right.
it turned into gaslighting.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And this is the other thing that I've heard. I've heard people say, well, they would acknowledge that there's problems with the hierarchy and the institution, and they'll say, well, I don't believe in any of that, but I just like to go to my local church. But the problem is that you cannot separate the two.
Well,
You
yeah,
cannot.
because I mean, by refusing to speak up, you're implicitly endorsing it. And they
Right.
think that if you show up in church and you keep giving, then you're good with what they're doing.
Right. And if you do give money to any individual church, some small portion of that
Right.
trickles all the way up to the Vatican. And there's a whole, I mean, that's a black box. I mean,
Right.
and I asked some questions about this and I kind of read some books about this, and the church finances, it's a complete black box, but it's all connected and it all funnels up. I mean, a portion of it different with each church. They have like different things worked out with each parish, but some percentage funnels up through the dioceses and ultimately up to the Vatican. So, if you give money to any individual church, you are giving to the larger institution and organization, and there's no way to disentangle that.
Right. Well, and one of the points I've made to people is that I went to my archbishop in March 2019 under the assumption that they were having problems raising money. But the fact is that the people of St. Louis continue to support the Archdiocese of St. Louis. And that's one of the reasons why the Archdiocese is not changing, because they don't see any need to change. They think
Mm,
that the people of St. Louis are completely fine with the treatment of survivors. Money talks. And
yes.
as long as you're showing them the money and they can show the money to the Vatican, then there's no problem and there's no reason to change.
Right. Absolutely. Um, I'm just looking real quick at my notes to see if there was anything else. Um, so, I mean, I guess, did you have anything else you want to add, or anything else to bring up?
Well, I've got your direct message. One was questions about my relationship with my parents,
Yes.
uh, which is tough because to a degree they saw some of this stuff happening and didn't take it as seriously as they could have. They were told about, apparently in fourth grade when stuff started happening, I started acting out and my teachers started seeing it and they brought it to my parents. So it's frustrating for me to think about that.
Mm-hmm.
That did make it easier for them because my parents could then say, okay, yeah, Mrs. Martinego in fourth grade pretty quickly said that you were acting differently, that I was acting down or depressed. So apparently I was showing signs of depression pretty quickly. That's difficult for me to process because my parents didn't really act on that information, although they were just lay people. My dad was a lawyer, my mom stayed at home and raised us, so they didn't have any psychological training. Parents nowadays need to educate themselves. If you see dramatic changes in your kids' personalities, you need to take that seriously. And you know one of the things my psychologist asked me was, well, what did your doctor say? I'm like, what do you mean, what did my doctor say? Well, when your parents took you to your doctor because you were showing these kind of personality changes, what happened? And I'm like, I never went to a doctor.
Mm-hmm.
uh, which is hard to process, although at least that made it easier for my parents to believe me. uh, my mom more than my dad, because she saw that stuff. uh, in some of my messages to moms that you have to own this stuff. You have to take this stuff seriously. Moms are just better at this stuff than men are. Moms are more sensitive to this stuff than men are. And if, some of childhood is changes as you pass through certain ages, walking and talking can get disruptive. But if there's no obvious, if your child is showing a change and there's no obvious reason for that change, then there may be something going on. And at a minimum, you should be talking to the pediatrician about it.
Mhm.
I think it's affected my dad's faith to a degree. During the whole pandemic, he's never done any Zoom church or anything like that. But it's definitely, it's very difficult. It's very hard on my parents to see what's going on and to think what they missed. But again, they were trusting people,
Mhm.
and they were deceived. And
Mm.
I have frustrations where everybody tells me to move on, but nobody can tell me how. uh, Ordinary people are not equipped to deal with this kind of stuff. I'll tell you, it doesn't help to tell a survivor to just move on, because my immediate question is how.
Mhm.
How do I deal with all this stuff? How do I process this stuff? Especially the stuff that the Archdiocese of St. Louis has done since 2002, that started with Cardinal Dolan,
Mhm.
where they can remove Valentine, but Dolan never circled back to me to say, how I gave you a hard no. Well, maybe it wasn't a hard no. How does a supposed man of God do that? And all
Right.
the stuff that's done, in 2013, when they permanently removed Valentine, they never got back to me. How does that happen? How do you do that? How does a Christian do that? Those are the questions that are really hard to process. And those are the things that are hard for me to handle.
Right. And I'm sure he never gave it another thought. I mean, it was just, I'm sure it was so inconsequential to him, but it was earth shattering to you.
Right. Yeah.
Mhm.
And earth shattering is a perfect way to put it. Uh, Maybe he didn't understand it at the time. But what I don't understand is that, okay, if Dolan didn't understand it in 2002, I can understand that. But then how in 2011
Mhm.
do you still not take it seriously? How in 2013, especially, how do you not let me know that you're going to remove my abuser? My psychologist at the time, I'd actually been seeing two psychologists at the time, and my psychologist had to call me on a Friday. I was at play practice for my kids, and she's like, "Have you seen it?" And I'm like, "Seen what?" She's like, "They just removed Valentine. They just permanently removed Valentine." I'm like, "Oh, and that ruined me for months." And what
Mm.
was the worst part about that was that the Archdiocese of St. Louis did that and never bothered to contact me. They couldn't
Mhm.
be bothered to contact me. That was the craziest part of the whole thing.
Right. Right. And then so not only the church you know, perpetuating this, but again, the elected officials, in your case, including Eric Schmidt and also Josh Hawley. I mean, I just think that can't be reiterated enough, because that's their job. I mean, that's what they're supposed to do. And I don't think we can count on any of them.
No, and
Sadly,
that's why
of
I've talked
either
about,
party. It
yeah,
doesn't
that's
matter.
well, and that's an important thing. This is a bipartisan issue. In
Mhm.
a lot of cases, liberals are worse than conservatives. Trump changed my view on a lot of that stuff. But it seems like there's a lot of, on the liberal side of things, people seem to act treat the world according to how they want it to be. They treat the
Mhm.
church how they want it to be. I think that's more of a problem on the liberal side of the spectrum, although Trump has exposed that it's certainly, Republicans are not immune to that. Uh,
Mhm.
but people have to be really realistic about this. And if they want to protect their kids, they have to be realistic, and they have to understand the incentives, and they have to understand that the lack of repentance on the part of the Catholic Church and, just kind of institutions in general. And they have to hold the press accountable.
Yes.
Why are you
Yes.
not telling us this stuff? Why are you enabling these guys? That's the
Right.
only way things are going to change.
Right. And I think also I don't also want to say that like I want a bunch of people to leave the church, but I mean, I made that choice, and I think it definitely more socially acceptable today to make that decision than it was even 10, 20 years ago. And I think it's necessary to have those kind of conditions, because as long as people feel like they have to go along with this program and they have to send their kids for the sacraments and they have to go through these motions, then that's where the obligation of silence and to go along with things just kept perpetuating. But I think what's different now, I hope at least, is that more people feel empowered to say, I don't want to be a part of this, and I'm not going to be a part of this.
No, and that's
Not being
absolutely
shunned and judged for that.
right. That's absolutely what people need to do. And I've made this point to other people, is that to a degree, the Catholic Church, because they think they have a monopoly on the Eucharist, they're using the Eucharist to hold people hostage, which I would argue profanes the Eucharist and means that
There's something very perverse about
right.
that.
You don't have to do something that is that perverse. I understand your reverence for the Eucharist, but when it's used to hold Catholics hostage and to keep Catholics from doing the right thing, that is a perversion. That's a profanity, and it means that if you want to leave, you have the ability to leave. I don't want you to leave. I want you to stay and fight. But if you leave, I would completely understand it, because it's a rational decision. It's what you have to do in order to protect your kids and to keep from enabling the Catholic Church.
Right.
So, all right,
Okay.
we've gone an hour and a half, but I think
Oh, wow.
uh
Well, this was fantastic.
no, this is
Thank you for including me and taking my questions. And I really respect and support what you're doing.
no, thank you, Amy Vaz. Very good questions, good interest. I think the world will be a better place because of people like you. So thank you very much.
Oh, likewise. Thank you.